Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For our video today, we're going to be looking at how you can embellish a beaded bangle. So I'm going to take you through the process of creating a beaded bangle and then we're going to add on some extra decoration. Let's head down to the board and take a closer look at those lovely beads. So the bead mix I used to create the bangle on the board is a Designed by Me in Red by Jessie James Beads. There will be a link in the bottom of the video tutorial if you'd care to check out their bead selection. I'm also going to be supplementing the second design we make together today with Gunmetal Roses, also by Jessie James Beads, because I'm in a bit of a red mood at the moment. One of the reasons I'm going to use this particular bead mix is because it contains beads that can spin on a bangle's core wire, and I'd like to show you a way which you can stop them from moving round so that they always face outwards. So let's talk about the wires that we're going to work with today. We're going to be using 3 different types of wire today, and we'll begin by using our core wire. Now I do prefer to have a strong core wire, however most beads usually in these mixes will accommodate a 1mm gauge wire, which is equivalent to 18 gauge, so that's what we'll work with, and we'll add residual strength by connecting extra wire around those beads as well. If you have incredibly large hole beads such as these in your mix, you can certainly go for a stronger central core wire, such as a 1.25 16 gauge or even a 1.5 or 1.6, which is approximately a 14 gauge wire. So I'm going to start off by loading lots of beads onto a length of wire. I'm going to be using 1mm 18 gauge and I have around about 14 inches. Now that seems quite a lot, but we do need to have a little bit of spare on the ends just to ensure that we can create those connections and that we can add as many beads as we desire. So I've combined those bead mixes to make one great big long strand, and I've added more beads than I think I'll need. And what we're going to do now is just turn over each of the ends on that strand of wire just to stop those beads escaping whilst we do most of the work. And then when we get towards the end of the project, we'll decide how many of the beads we want to keep, and then we can tie those two ends together. So let's head back down to the board and start playing. So to stop my beads escaping whilst we're doing most of the work today, I'm just going to turn a tiny loop on either end, and you can use your round nose pliers, bail makers, or indeed your memory wire pliers. So just turn those ends over. If you warm your wire through first, you'll still find that you might even be able to use those end pieces. But the key here is if you make quite small loops, then you're not going to lose overly much. If you are working for a particularly large wrist or you want a very large bangle, then do add a little bit extra to that 14-inch length. So what we're going to do is start off by centralising the middle bead. Now because I want to show you how to embellish a flat round bead, I'm going to repeat that in the centre of my demonstration bangle. So I'm going to centralise that wire to begin with, and we're just going to ensure that that bead is centralised rather. Because I warmed my wire through, that's quite pliable. I can just get that to sit exactly how I want. Now the second strand of wire we're going to be using is a 0.8mm or 20 gauge wire. Now the longer the piece of wire you work with at this stage, the better. So I'm just going to unspool about 30 inches, approximately 2.5 feet. So let's just unspool some of that wire. Now what will happen is this will most definitely hit the camera or the microphone or something. So what I'm going to do is just warm that through a little bit at the ends and start rotating each end around to create this kind of just a little gently rolled up section. You must ensure that you warm your wire through first, because then you will still be able to use it. If you come in from the cold with your wire and you start using it when it's very, very cool and hard, it's less likely to be able to be smoothed back out again later. So we're going to start by embellishing this central coin or flat round bead. It doesn't have to be this puffy, it can be whatever you want really, but in order for us to embellish it with seed beads later, it's really nice if it's a flatter round shape. So I've got in the central section around about 4 or 5 inches of naked wire, and that's where we're going to start. Even though that wire is contained, it still catches on the desk, always good fun. So once that's warmed through, what I'm going to do is come over to one side of that central section of the 0.8 or 20 gauge wire and just lay it in position over the top of my design. And I'm going to wrap that around the core wire. Things will slide around on the board, so don't worry. If you want to, you can use a gentle peg or a bead stopper just to hold those out of the way, but I generally find it's not that much of a bother. So I'm going to rotate that around twice, so I've got 2 coils. Now, because these 2 wires are quite close in their gauge, it can be a little bit difficult to get that to coil up neatly. So what I tend to do is give it a start and then just gently use a pair of flat facing, quite fine tipped pliers. These are my bent chain nose pliers, just to tighten that up a little bit. So once I'm happy that that's a little bit neater, we're going to embellish that central coin or flat bead. If I turn the whole thing over, naturally enough it's going to catch on everything, but I'm right dominant and I can definitely coil the wire a little bit neater with my right hand. So what we want to do now is to chase around the edge of that flat round central bead, but what we don't want to do is to make it very, very tight and close. So what I'm going to do is just push the bead against the lighter gauge wire to make sure that I get the exit angle from that core nice and straight and coming out away. And then I'm going to wrap around on the other side. Now at this stage, my lighter wire, that 0.8 or 20 gauge, is coming away from the top of the core. So just for this instance, I'm going to take the wire back to the top of the core as well. And in that way, you have your nice symmetrical central point. I just tilt that in the light, you can see what I'm talking about. Now what I'm going to do now is rotate twice around the core wire with my lighter wire again. What I don't want to do is to eat away at that distance and bring that too tight around the edge of the coin bead. So we're going to just make sure that we give a little bit of a gap just here. Not a massive gap, but enough to get that rotating smoothly and for there to be enough space for us to play later on, adding some smaller beads. Now, one of the things that you can do at this stage, if it's easier for you, is to add on your row of those seed beads with a lighter gauge wire now. However, I'll show you later on how to do that effectively once you've completed the design. Sometimes you might decide after you've done the rest of the embellishments that you don't want to add seed beads, so I kind of do that a bit later on just to make sure that I'm happy with the overall aesthetic. So what I'm going to do is take my bent chain nose pliers, hold it on that 0.8 or 20 gauge wire at the place, the position that I want it to bend around the core wire. So I think that's a little bit large at the moment, so I'll just pop that on and I'll pinch those wires together. It's the same wire, just rotating around, and I can see that that is in fact a little bit larger than I need. Naturally enough, my 2 little coils of wire have got entangled. This is something that happens when you work with wire, so we're just going to unentangle those and move them in opposite directions a little bit. So because I want to shrink this down, it's a really good opportunity to show you what can happen when you don't want it to happen. So if I don't pinch tight enough and I start rotating my wire around the core, you'll see that that shrinks right up. So I've in fact used some of the wire from this side just on there to go into that rotation. So that's gone smaller than I want it to. So what we're going to do is just press those 2 wires together to create that coil and then just reverse the action a little bit. It's a really good opportunity to show you why I do some of the funny things I do. So if I just rotate that backwards, you'll find that we get a little bit more airspace. And now I've got the exact distance between my flat bead and that little rainbow shape that we've created. So what we need to do now is to ensure that we don't again change that. So I'm just going to give that wire a little bit of a gentle squish to set that in position. And then I'm going to pinch very firmly on this little rainbow shape of wire whilst I bring that tail of wire around again. So I've got the same number of wraps on either side and I've retained that space between the bead and the little rainbow of wire that embellishes around it. So you might decide that all you want is that little rainbow embellishment around your bead. That's absolutely fine. Before we move on, I'm going to squish very, very carefully and gently on either side I might just turn that sideways so I can tighten that coil up neatly, just to make sure that you're happy with that central section. Now at this stage, you should be able to move that core bead just a little bit if it's come out of the centre. So when I've added all of my beads from those 2 bead mixes, I have gone for a symmetrical design. So it's really easy to see that I'm just a little bit too far to the left. So before I go any further, I'm going to scooch that bead over, very, very gently horseshoe that wire around. I can still go a little bit further to the right, and in that way we will set that central bead actually centrally. Let's try that one more time. That looks pretty symmetrical to me. So the next thing we're going to do is to embellish these beads that like to spin around. So let us, first of all, unfurl a little bit of this crunched up wire, give it a bit of a smooth through. And I'm just going to show you very quickly how you can stop these beads from moving too much. So it's a lovely, lovely rose bead. If you pop that on a bracelet, what often happens is it spins around because the face is heavier. There's more depth to it, so there's more weight there. And what I actually want is for this to sit outwards on the wrist. So to do that, I'm going to use these petals as a point in which I can attach that bead to the core wire and prevent it from spinning. So I'm going to pull the wire that is circling around the core. This is the 0.8 or 20 gauge, currently coming away from underneath. So I'm going to draw that around the outside of that rose bead, take the tail over the top of that wire, wrap it around the core one time. Now we've got half of that already ensconced. So let me just show you the sideways view. Coming from underneath to over the top of the core. That's only part of the job though. So if I just spin this around so that it's up the other way now, I'm going to again warm that lighter wire, bring it around the side of that bead, and then just show you where it sits just slightly under those petals. Draw the tail of wire around the wrap we made initially and back in the opposite direction. I'm going to spin this around again so that my right hand can do the thing that it's good at. And this time I'm going to go above one of those petals. So let's just smooth that wire through again, draw it around, currently on the top of the core wire. And you can see I'm capturing that petal, draw it across the top or underneath, whichever is your preference, as long as you remember to do the same in mirror on the other side. I think because I usually go, apart from that central one, that's a separate issue, I usually go from the top to underneath. So let's go that way again. So from the top, around the petal, underneath the core wire, and then I'm going to wrap twice around just the core wire, and you'll find that that rose no longer spins on the core. So when I'm making a design like this, what I will always do is just one bead at a time on either side, so I can remember exactly where I took each of those passes of wire. So I'm going to do that now, and then I'll meet you back here in a moment and we'll show you what to do with some differently shaped beads. It's very easy to work with rounds and rondelles, but let's show you how easy it is to work with a cube bead as well. So I've just repeated on the second side the same process, and generally speaking it doesn't matter if you're going from underneath to over the top, as long as you're mirroring that if you're looking for a symmetrical look. So you can even break it down further and just do one manoeuvre on one side, repeat in mirror on the other side, and then you won't get lost or forget what it is you've done. So for the next section, we're going to skirt around the outside of an odd shaped bead. So in this instance, it's a cube bead followed by a rondelle. So I'll show you how to do these in a very simplistic fashion. My finer gauge wire, which is the 0.8 or 20 gauge, is coming off the top of the core. So if I push my cube bead into position, I'm going to draw that wire, making sure it's toasty warm, all the way around the outside edge from the top to the underneath. And this is just a classic bead wrap on a beaded bangle. And if you want those shapes to be a little bit sharper, you can very, very gently get in there with a pair of pliers just to enhance those shapes. Like so. You'll see we've made a slightly firmer bend on that side. Make sure it all lines up, and then you can do the same on the other side if you wish to. So let's cross that a little bit. That fits nice and neatly. So you can see we've made that quite angular, or you can go for that softer look if you prefer. So I'm going to wrap around that core wire 2.5 times. Now my wrapping wire is underneath. Push my rondelle into position, and I'm going to draw the wire around the outside using exactly the same technique on a different shaped bead. So draw that around the edge of the bead, and I've done on purpose this fashion of one side and then the other. So you can do it all on the same side, and then you can go back in the opposite direction if you want, or you can just do it on opposing beads. As long as you practice the same in opposition on the other side of that central bead, you'll get a lovely symmetrically looking wrapped bangle. So we're going to do something different on this next elongated bead. I think I'd quite like to have something on the surface this time. So like I did with this, is it a hexagon? Yes, it is. A hexagon bead. I've brought the pass of wire, instead of going around the edge like the golden bead, I've pulled it across the surface. And we're going to do a combination of this design and this design, which was on this angular sort of oval, maybe diamond shaped bead. We're going to add a little bit of interest to the surface as well. So let's just pop that out of the way before I knock it over. So let's push that bead into position, and this works really well with larger beads. This is the upward face of my bangle, so this will be going around the outside on the back of the wrist. And what I'm going to do, show you first of all that my finer wire is on the underside, the underside as you're looking on the screen, but it's on top of that core wire. So my bead has a slightly flatter nature. It's broader on this axis, so I'm going to draw that wire across the surface of that bead, giving that a really lovely warm, and I'm going to press down in approximately the middle and just draw that wire back around, pressing down again like so, and I'm just popping a little bit of a loop decoration over the centre of that bead. It's a little bit tricky to tell on this colourway, so I'm just going to bring the bead out of position and show you what that looks like. Just a little bit of a loop. So I started from the lower side, so I'm going to go to the upper side over here and just draw that wire all the way around, again 2.5 times, so that it pops back out in this orientation. And that leaves me with 2 beads. What I'm going to do now is just repeat this on the opposite side, and we'll see how big our bangle is getting before we wrap those last 2 beads, because we may find that we don't need them, or in fact that we need to add extra. So let's just repeat that on the other side, and then I'll meet you back here in a second. So I've just added the same decoration on the opposite side, and we're going to start shaping the bead as if it's going to go round our wrist, which means that we want the face we want to see to be going around the outside. So be very delicate with your beads, and hopefully you won't have any issues with them shattering or anything. And let's just draw this around in the basic shape. Now, if you have a bangle form, do feel free to use that as a guide. Let's just flip that over the other way for a second. But I'm just going to offer my wrist into the gap because I'm going to make this one for me. So if I just hold that in position for a moment, I'm going to try sliding my wrist in. That looks to be a really good size, so you can see that we can definitely add a little bit of basic embellishment to these outer 2 beads before we start to connect that bangle together. So I'm just going to do some of the simple wraps as we did earlier on and finish by wrapping twice or 3 times around the end section here, and I'll join you back in a moment. So I had a couple of inches of wire left of the finer gauge at each end, so I trimmed that to about 1 inch and just made some teeny tiny spirals, which I've left sitting at a jaunty angle for the moment. And the reason for that is that you can use it to cover any little bits that don't look quite as perfect as you want. So always keep that little bit of wire left over until the last minute, and then you can always use it if you need to cover something that is slightly less than perfect. So let's head down to the board, and then we'll close the bangle up, and then we can move on with the seed bead embellishment of that central flat coin bead. Now there are 2 ways in which you can finish a bangle like this. You can create a wrapped loop on one end and then a very simple hook clasp on the other end so that you have an open and closable link to your bangle, or you can just seal them up altogether. If you are going to seal them up, do estimate around about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch for your closure. Try that again to make sure it fits, and then you know that you'll be able to make a closed bangle like the one we have as an example. You could, as I say, create a hook on one side if you wanted one which was closer to the wrist, more form-fitting, but obviously you wouldn't be able to get that over the hand unless you dislocate your thumb. So do just check that that fits before you seal the ends up. Now to do that, I'm going to create 2 interlocking closed loops. So these will be wrapped loops, so I'm going to leave a tiny space, just the breadth across the tip of my bent chain nose pliers. Turn the wire away at right angles. We're going to create a wrapped loop at this end. Now you've seen me do this dozens of times, so sorry if that's boring, you can always fast forward this bit. Draw the wire all the way around. Let's just show you, that's a wrapped loop there. And I'm going to draw the wire tightly and firmly around that little gap that we just left. So just making sure that you can see what I'm doing. Draw that around as tightly as you can, as long as you've got at least 2 rotations. And it doesn't really matter if you slightly twist that, as long as the next loop we make is in opposition to it. So I'm going to trim that wire away. That's good for making coils on another project. And I'm just going to tidy up this last little bit. So to do that, I'm just going to pinch the end of my wrapped loop and just tuck that tail away. Now, before we decide where we're going to press that little coil down, I'm just going to ignore it for the time being. Now, when we come to create the second wrapped loop, it needs to be at 90 degrees opposition. So because I slightly twisted that when I was creating it, it's now sitting flat to the desk. So the other loop needs to be coming up from the desk. And I just need to make sure that I don't manhandle it quite so firmly as I did. Now we don't make the complete loop shape. We're going to make half of a loop to begin with. So if I just show you that up to the camera, get my hand out of the way. And I'm just going to trim that hook off the end, because otherwise it's a bit tricky to do the thing. Let's pop that in the scrap pot for later. And what we're going to do is just allow that to slide inside the wrapped loop we've already created, or back out again as the case might be. And then we're just going to very, very softly continue with the formation of that loop shape, like so. So it's a little bit janky, but you can make that a little bit tidier if you desire, as long as you can see that they are interlinked loops. What you can do is just very, very gently twist that out of true for a second and get more roundness in that loop, and then you'll be happier with it in the long run. I couldn't leave it. So let's grip across that loop shape. Again, not squishing anywhere that wires cross over. And we're going to rotate this wire around the core until we have filled that gap neatly. You're going to need at least 2 turns of wire to make that safe and secure. Let's just push that loop back out of the way for a second, bring that over for a last rotation, and then trim that tail away. Pop this in the scrap pot for melting. And then we're going to tuck this last little sticky uppy bit of wire away. Hold the whole thing together. You might need to support your loop as you do this, just turning over the top. And if you lack the grip strength, you can always employ a second set of flat facing pliers to hold that. And then you can decide where you want your little end coils to sit. So that's actually reasonably neat, but if it wasn't neat and you didn't like it, you've got something to just sit over the surface like so, just to disguise it if it's imperfect. So I'll just push this one back up to the top, and I'll do the same. That can come down flat on top of the little wrapped loops we just made. So that's your basic bead bangle with captured rotating beads. So these rose beads will now not spin on the wrist. But what we're going to do now as a last step is embellish your central coin bead. So I have to tell you, I am not an expert with seed beads. The holes infuriate me. They're too tiny for me to see, and I'm not very good at it, to be frank. But what they are good for is embellishing the designs that I love to create. So I'm working with beads that are just slightly larger than 2mm. I believe that they are 11 zeros. Like I said, I'm not a seed bead user, nor am I an expert in the field, but I am going to show you just how to add some on to embellish that central flat coin bead. So we're going to be working with this little rainbow shape that we created at the beginning of the tutorial. I'm just going to put my thumbnail under there to make sure it's the right shape. If you need to get in there, you can spin that coin bead through 90 degrees and you can just refine that shape if you've accidentally done anything horrible to it. You can also give it a little bit of a strengthen. If you spin your main bead out of the way, let me just try to hold that still. You can give that a bit of a squish to add some residual strength. Do take a moment though to make sure that you're happy with that form. Thumbnails are absolutely brilliant for stuff like this because they do have that nice curvature over the back of them. So what I'm going to do is to add in a length of 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire. This is a scrap. I think you're probably going to need about 12 inches. So let's start by winding on 3 times around. Doesn't really matter where you start because we're going to move that winding. So you don't need a huge amount over the top. What we're going to do is just feed that through, probably about 3/4 of an inch. I'm just going to put my hand over the rest of that wire to try and keep it out of the way. Didn't want to do that. There we are. So as long as you start with at least 3 wraps, but what I tend to do is go for a few more so I can push that right down into the corner of that little rainbow shape we're working with. So draw that wire as tightly and as firmly around as you possibly can. And what I might do is just keep going until I get to the end of this piece of wire and just count those coils and try to do the same at the other end. If you struggle at any point, as long as you've got 3 good wraps, you can simply trim that tail away. I'm going to make sure that I get all of that underneath. That looks like 6 wraps to me. And then what I need to do is to compress that coil up. Now you can use pliers to do this, but I find it's a little bit safer where beads are concerned to use your thumbnails. So I've used a different colour wire again just to make sure that it's easy to see. We're going to scooch that all the way down to one side. It does not matter one bit which side you start from. Give that a push until it sits right down, as close to the core of your design as possible. Now your central bead, your coin or your flat or puffy bead, whatever you chose to use, is going to rotate around whilst you're doing this, and that I think is a joy when you're wearing the design. Bit fiddly when you're trying to record about it. So I'm just going to take a second. That's a little bit better. Now I'm going to add in my first bead, taking note to see that my finer wire is underneath the little rainbow shape. So if I find the end of that finer gauge wire, grab hold of one of the little seed beads, little blighters. I think it's orchid, this colourway, but I could be wrong. And like I said before, I'm not an expert in seed beads, so they might be 11/0s, they might not be. I really don't know. There's no information on the packaging. So what we're going to do is to sit that bead against the rainbow as tightly and as firmly as possible. Draw the tail of the wire up and over the top, inside that rainbow, and I'm going to draw that tail all the way around. Now the wire I'm using is very, very tense, so the bead has just flicked off the top. It's a scrap from my desk, so you might be better to use fresh wire. Soft wire might be better. So I've just got that bead to sit around the outside of the rainbow, and I'll zoom in a little bit at this point for you to see. And then I'm going to wrap 3 times with my fine wire around that little rainbow shape. So having a little bit of a fingernail helps, but my fingernails are terrible. They're not strong, they're not beautiful. They see a lot of abuse when I'm making wire work and doing all of the other things. So let's bring that tail through for a second time, pull that nice and neatly into position, scooch that coil up, and then we're going to go for a 3rd rotation. Draw that all the way through, and then make sure that your coils are nice and neat and tidy. Now that's where having a little bit of extra residual strength in that little rainbow of wire really helps, because it's quite easy when you're working with that 0.8 or 20 gauge wire to just make a mashup of that section. So do give it a strengthen if you're able to. And then when you get to add your second bead, just make sure that the first bead is sat on the outside and it doesn't twist around. By the time you've added your 3rd or 4th bead, it will stop wanting to twist around quite so much. So let's just add a second bead, and then I will leave it with you to finish that little embellishment on that rainbow. Slide that down into position, draw the wire around. So when you're embellishing a section of wire with small beads, as we are now, always pay attention to where the wire starts and finishes. So my finer gauge wire has started underneath the rainbow. Once I've passed it through the bead, I want it to go over the top. So as long as you're always rotating in the same direction, you will get that little effect where the beads all sit in the same orientation. So let's bring that second wire through. Draw that down so it's nice and neat and tidy. You can do that with a set of pliers, but you do need to protect your beads because they're delicate little things. So let's go for a third rotation around that core, and then I'll show you the completed piece, like so. Make sure that your beads are sitting where you want them to before you add the next one. It's kind of tricky to fix it when you've got loads of delicate little beads on there. So I'm going to show you the piece I completed, which is here, and you can see there are 3 or 5 wraps, I can't remember what I did to be honest, in between each bead, and then the beads sit in a little halo around the outside. Now I made that quite tight to my core bead, but that core bead is still spinnable, like so. So you have got something to mess with if you desperately need it. Some of the other things that you can do is you can add on a charm at the centre of your bangle. So I just created a jump ring and added one in, but another thing that you can do is add in a dropper of your choice. When you're creating those wrapped loops, you can pop that in one of the wrapped loops and then it's nice and solid. I like adding it on with a jump ring. You could even add it on with a small lobster clasp or a little clasp of your choice, just so that you can remove it if you prefer. That's what that little swirly embellishment looks like on a different coloured bead. And you can see that we've followed all of these techniques in our demonstration today. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed making the embellished bead bangle with me today. These are the Jessie James beads mixes that I've worked with today. Obviously, you can use whatever beads fit on your core wire, but if you'd like to have a look at Designed by Me in red and those gunmetal roses, I'll pop a link in the video description for you to hop over to the site and have a gander. My name is Gem Hawkes. We're working on YouTube today, so let's have a glorious day together, and I'll see you again very, very soon. Bye for now.